Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the May 23rd meeting of the City of Oneonta Planning Commission. Clerk, could you please do a roll call members?
Chair Lappin.
Here.
Vice Chair Marino.
Here.
Commissioner Maskin. Commissioner Basket.
Here.
Councilor Makucci.
Here.
Councilor Tomato. Councilmember Roosevelt.
Here.
Thank you. I'd like to welcome Vice Chair Marino back and congratulate her on her recent having a new kid. And also I'd like to recognize that we have Susan Lettuce here attending this meeting as an observer. Has there been any correspondence?
There's none.
Are there, yes, I should say there are no petitioners, so approval of minutes from the April meeting. Are there any questions or corrections? Hearing none, is there a motion to approve? I don't know if we can vote because Vice Chair Marino wasn't here.
She's still eligible to vote if she chooses.
Okay, up to you. Do I hear a motion to approve?
Okay, motion to approve.
Motion made by Commissioner Makucci,
I'll second.
seconded by Commissioner Baskin. I guess we can do all those in favor say aye, right? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Approved. Okay, so old business, help to have Steve here. We can at least get started. So, we have the, New York State Environmental Quality Review Act, kind of process to follow for the proposed amendments to the U zone, which is section 300-13 of the City of Oneonta's zoning code. So there are a couple things we need to do, which might involve printing. So we need to do part 2 of the full EAF. We're gonna print. And so essentially in part 1, which was prepared by Steve, they did the initial kind of ballpark estimate of whether or not the proposed action, in this case, the legislative amendment, would have a significant adverse environmental impact, and asked a series of questions. Based on the answers to those questions, Steve populated that initial part 1 of the EAF. And now there's a more detailed list of questions, which is known as part 2 of the environmental assessment form, which Carrie will be bringing out for us. And so that'll require us to go item by item, and then we'll be required to prepare part 3 of the environmental assessment form, which required us to make a determination as to whether or not the proposed legislative amendments will have a significant adverse environmental impact. And, issue either a positive declaration saying that it will, and outlining our reasoning for why we believe so, or that it will not, which would be a negative declaration, and we'd be required to outline our reasoning for arriving at the conclusion as well. Any questions? So, going through part 2 is a relatively, it's long, not long, but it takes time to go through each question and discuss, particularly if there's items of debate, although with the legislative amendment, it's not particularly crazy or anything. So, although that said, zoning amendments are weird under seeker because we're not looking at the zoning change as a whole. We're looking at future development that it contemplates and what that would look like if new development were to come into that zone, how would it affect the environment, and would the new regulations put forward under this code adversely affect the environment if this code were followed based on its intent. So we have to be careful not to segment the review of this project, especially when we're dealing with zoning changes or comprehensive plan updates, etc. So in one way is we're required to look at, very broad range of the potential impacts and be thorough in how we look at things. And as we've seen, the U zone amendments have been the source of some controversy and even the threat of legal action, so it's imperative that we, proceed carefully. So with that said, there's a 18 page or 18 part list of questions that we can run through. And my thought is, each section has a list of sub-questions. If you feel that any of these subsections involves a more thorough discussion, we can kind of move through the list. If not, we can just move from part to part. So the first part of 18 is the impact on land, and specifically, we're being asked if the proposed action may involve, construction on or physical alteration of the land surface on the proposed site. And we have to think about whether this answer is no or yes. And if it's yes, then we go through each sub question and discuss how we feel about, its potential environmental impact. So thoughts on number 1, or I can just kind of run through either way.
We don't have a copy of that.
It's 10 pages, so I didn't print. I just printed the 2, but I'm gonna put it up on the screen.
Alright, great.
So you can kind of
It's
see.
a little small, but
And this other document that we have kind of goes through what you're going through.
Yeah, it's part 3, so it's kind of we'll get to that, but then I prepared initial determination based on the thing, but due to public, open meetings law, I couldn't discuss it outside of a public forum with you guys, unfortunately. So the first question is whether the proposed action may involve construction on or physical alteration on the land of the proposed site. My thought on this one is that the proposed action in and of itself will not, but future development contemplated under the zoning code will, so I would say, this would be a yes.
Right.
And I would treat each action, each of these sub-questions kind of the same, in that the new zoning code has very strict design standards and site plan review guidelines that will require applicants to avoid any of the sensitive areas contemplated under this section, right? So they're not gonna, for example, it's not gonna allow development on, slopes greater than 15%. It's not going to, allow for construction under, where bedrock is disposed or generally within 5 feet of the existing ground surface. All applicants will be required to, prepare and submit appropriate permits, and that the planning commission site plan review process will be detailed enough, especially with design standards, to ensure that each of these items is a no or small impact. So basically, it would be all of the above. Is there any debate or any questions or disagreement? Are there things you want to bring up? Any discussion? All good? Okay. Moving right along, so impact on geological features. So the answer for this again would be I would almost say this would be a no, because there are no officially recognized geologic features or landforms that are within the U zone, and additionally. All future development contemplated in the U zone code would be required to obtain appropriate permits from relevant state agencies and be required to submit detailed site plans for the commission's review that avoid any sensitive, geologic resources and or sensitive soils. So I just kind of put no. That's kind of my thought. Are there any discussion, questions? Okay, moving right along. Impacts on surface water. So I put, my thought would be to put yes, because the area, the U zone is largely sloped, water does run downhill. But for example, the proposed action's not likely to create a new water body. We're not gonna create any lakes. Generally, the soils aren't good for retention basins anyway, so that, but if they do so, that'll be part of a stormwater pollution prevention plan, which is intended to minimize surface water runoff offsite, or essentially make it so that no additional water runs offsite than what's already there. The proposed action is not likely to, the future development under, the U zone, contemplated under the U zone regulations, is not gonna result in a lot of dredging. We're not in an area where dredging would even be considered, so the answer for that would be no. The proposed action, future development contemplated under the U zone code may involve construction adjoining a freshwater wetland But as per DEC regulations, they'll be required to minimize, avoid disturbing them without an appropriate permit from the Department of Environmental Conservation or the Army Corps of Engineers. So future development, will be required to, avoid negatively affecting wetlands. So the answer for that would be no as well. The proposed action may create turbidity in a water body either from upland erosion runoff or by disturbing bottom sediments. That's likely the case with construction, especially on construction if there's a slope or with water running downhill. However, a fully implemented stormwater pollution prevention plan will require that there's no net increase in runoff, and that will have to be approved by the DEC. And then also additionally, the Planning Commission has discretion under the regulations to require limits on impervious cover and also the implementation of additional stormwater controls as to, based on, beyond what's already proposed by a future applicant. The next question is whether the proposed action may include construction of one or more intakes or withdrawal of water from surface water. The answer for that would be no, because they'd be connected to city water. The next is whether the proposed action may include construction of one or more outfalls for discharge of wastewater to surface water. The answer for that would also be no, because under conditions of stormwater pollution prevention plan, there's supposed to be no net increase of runoff coming off site. Next is whether the proposed action may cause soil erosion, otherwise create a source of stormwater discharge. With new development, particularly if it's a large development project, there might be temporary issues with soil erosion and stormwater discharge, particularly in heavy rain events. However, those will be temporary and fully mitigated by stormwater pollution prevention plans, and and the construction activities will be required by New York State law to have a supervising engineer on staff to ensure that stormwater controls are functioning properly. So the answer for that would also be no. Next is whether the proposed action may affect water quality of any water bodies within or downstream of the proposed action. Again, with new development, it's likely to be minor. The U-Zone code does not allow heavy industry uses or anything that has significant adverse impacts on water quality. So there may be some turbidity as a result of new construction, but that's likely to be minor and localized to the project site and immediate water bodies. So I think that would again be no. Whether the proposed action might involve the application of pesticides or herbicides in and around any water body. Just by the nature of the U-Zone, that's unlikely because, the existing water bodies are, kind of channelized and, I guess it'd be really difficult to kind of apply pesticides just by the physical and geographical layout of the U-Zone. So the answer for that would be no. Next is whether the proposed action may require the construction of new or expansion of existing wastewater treatment facilities. The answer is no, because the city's wastewater treatment systems are more than adequate to sustain new development. So I don't really see any additional impacts. Any discussion on this item? And if I'm running too fast, you can just stop me and tell me to slow down.
B is a no as well.
B is a no, because we're not filling in any existing water bodies. Impact on groundwater. The answer would be is likely no, because any new project would connect to city water, and the city uses a surface water resource reservoir, so chances are you wouldn't be drawing down groundwater. So we can just say no for that one. Impact on flooding. So there are areas within the 100-year and 500-year floodplain in the U-Zone. But any development, proposal that comes in as part of site plan review will likely be required by the commission to avoid being placed in the 100-year or 500-year floodplain, particularly new residential, commercial construction, or institutional construction. It'd be very difficult for them to obtain insurance if they were in a floodplain. It's possible that some passive uses might be within a floodplain, like a ball field or some other area, but it's not going to result in development that would shrink the floodplain or adversely affect it or speed up water in any way. So my thought would be this would also be a no. However, we could say that, again, the site plan review component of the U-zone legislation also allows the planning commission substantial discretion in limiting impervious cover, and also implementing green infrastructure to slow water down. So in the event that there's a major rain event and water's running downhill, we would have the appropriate stormwater controls to slow it down. Yeah. So impacts on air is also, I would say it's also a no, because the type of development contemplated under the U-zone code will not result in air emissions that will, trigger regulatory standards. Impacts on plant and animals. I said, my thought is this would be a yes, but, I think that, any time we build on open space, particularly on like the college campuses or around it, with the solar project, we had to pay attention to whether, wildlife travel would be fragmented or impeded in any way. So there are, and there are bald eagles that are within the U zone. However, it's also important to note that the U zone is largely physically disturbed. Majority of the area is developed and are fragmented as a result of existing development. So, the proposed action is not likely to, future development, that comes as a result of, the U-zone regulations or is considered under the U-zone regulations will not likely, cause a reduction in population of any threatened or endangered species. Again, having, the ability to regulate design and layout of the buildings in a lot of detail would give us a lot of latitude in preserving green space, and, and future reviews would require the applicant to demonstrate that their project would not, further fragment, wildlife corridors or adversely affect, birds, for example. So we're not, we wouldn't allow, like, for example, big wind turbines, located in close proximity to a, scenic flyway for birds and or endangered birds. So next is whether the proposed action may result in reduction or degradation of any habitat used by any rare, endangered, or threatened species. Again, the kind of the kicker here is that the majority of the land's already disturbed, but the site plan review process and design standards would allow us to make sure that any, area that could potentially be considered habitat would be protected, and that development is conducted, at a density level that maximizes the preservation of open space rather than, allowing sprawling kind of development. So the answer for that would be no. And then the other two, were pertain to like, state listed species, and so they would also be no for the reasons we stated in A and B above. So for E, there are no natural landmarks in Otsego County that I'm aware of. So the answer for that would be no. And all the other areas, F would also be no, because there's no designated significant natural community. So in this case, because there's a presence of bald eagles, so in the event that the initial site investigation for future development proposal would notice a bald eagle nest, they'd be required to avoid it and avoid any construction activities that would disturb it, particularly during nesting season. So again, that's something that would come out as a result of the site plan review, and the planning commission would be required under seeker to pay attention to it going forward. So provided that all applicable regulations are followed, this would also be a no. So this, H would also be a no. Future development might, result in the, conversion of 10 acres of forest. But again, that's something that the commission would, exercise, a lot of oversight and, I guess control over to make sure that, conversion of existing forest land is minimized to the greatest extent practicable. Obviously we wouldn't want, folks with a lot of forested property to knock it down in favor of new development, without, considering appropriate other, alternative design options. So provided that we follow our, existing guidelines under the U-zone code, this would be a no. So whether the proposed action, again, whether it involves the use of herbicides or pesticides, it's likely that future development will involve the use of herbicides or pesticides. However, they'll be done so in a way that complies with appropriate state and federal guidelines, so this would also be a no. Next is impact on agricultural resources. I would say the answer would be no, because we're not in a protected agricultural district and we don't have any agricultural resources within the city limits. If, I mean, you could count the Hartwick Grain Innovation Center, but that's more on the, value added side, so I would say no. Impact on aesthetic resources, this could be an area, of debate, perhaps, so my initial thought in light of the Hartwick College solar project, I would say yes. So the proposed action might be visible from any designated state, federal, local, or scenic aesthetic resource. Answer would be no, because we don't have any of those. And that's kind of an important distinction that needs to be made. While people might enjoy the view from places like Strawberry Fields or like SUNY Oneonta's campus, it's not a recognized visual or aesthetic resources that would require some level of designation from the local or state government. And also in the case of Hartwick College is private property, and so they have the ability to use land as deemed allowable by the existing zoning code. So that's also important to know. B is whether the proposed action might result in the obstruction, elimination of significant screening of one or more designated scenic views. Answer would be no, because again, while that might, the obstruction might occur, there's no officially designated scenic view within the city limits. C is whether the proposed action might be visible from publicly accessible vantage points. This would be yes, but again, the whole intent of the code is to preserve the existing built and natural environment and to ensure that development exists harmoniously with what's already there, so that new development is mindful of the existing architectural and natural character of the U zone. And so my thought process is, provided the planning commission exercises, its powers under the U zone regulations, that both answers would be no. D is whether the situation or activity in which viewers are engaged while viewing the proposed action. So I think that, again, this would be both no, because the views in the U zone, particularly, are kind of obstructed. You don't get you're not going to get like a scenic vista coming down like the road. You're going to kind of, you're not going to you don't have the topography is not such where you'd have like a scenic view. You'll be see a really long way, with the exception of maybe Strawberry Fields, or once you get higher up on the hills, you can kind of see if you're on foot. However, again, the site plan review portion of the U zone code would allow the planning commission to protect, sight lines. So like, for example, requiring that the trail on Strawberry Fields is relocated, so we'd still be allowed to use the view and enjoy the view while still having that development there. And so by having, being able to regulate the layout on the site plan review process, we'd be able to protect those view sheds. But I don't believe that our existing road network would kind of lead to like a really scenic view, unless I'm missing something.
Would that include the trails that are up?
Yeah, but I'm like thinking about like the road network from like the trails you can see. But if there's a project that would affect the trails, like with Hartwick College, we would have, as a commission, we'd have a lot of discretion in making sure that those trails are protected.
Okay.
So I guess that would be no. So E, the answer would also be no, because again, there's no designated aesthetic resource in the community, and I think that's something to consider down the road for council, but not as part of this review. So again, I think there are similar projects visible within the following distance of the proposed project. I mean, future development proposals will be likely to be required, be of a similar design and layout as what's already there. So this would be a yes, but if our regulations are followed, particularly those under the new university form-based code, the answer for that would be no, because you wouldn't really be able to tell from the outside that the development is starkly different than what's already there. So next is impact on historic and archaeological resource. So the answer for this would also be yes. There's one, we'll get to this in part 3, there's one, listed historic property, which is Brzee Hall. That's on SUNY's campus?
I think so, yeah.
So I missed that in the neg deck, but, so Brzee Hall is the only one there.
And it might actually be Hartwood.
Hartwick College, maybe it's Hartwick College. So, again, that's on like a confined campus, and so that area's like fully developed already. So, I don't think there'd be an impact on that resource under the new code, provided, if, God forbid, if Hartwick College ever changes ownership or something happens, that campus will still be protected, and they'll have to comply with appropriate SHPO regulations with regard to that building. So the answer So that will, would be yes, there's gonna be, unless there is a historic resource, but there's not likely to be any impact as a result of future development of the view zone code. Next is whether the action might occur wholly within or partially within or substantially contiguous to an area listed as a designated sensitive archaeological site. Answer would be no, because there are no such sites near the proposed area covered by the proposed action. C is whether the proposed action may occur wholly or partially within or substantially contiguous to an archaeological site not included on the SHPO inventory. And so that's a tricky one. I would say no, because as part of the, survey component of a, major site plan review, a project that requires major site plan review, if they sense that there's a possibility of archaeological resources, they'll be required to do a phase 1 cultural resources, phase 1A cultural resource survey. And if they do find something, they'll be required to do a phase 1B. And with both of those, they'll be required not only to delineate where those archaeological resources are, but protect them and make sure that they're not, disturbed. So I would say that, this would not even the future development contemplated in this code is not likely to have an impact on that. And so the next section is if we insert moderate to large, I don't think we need to go through that. Impact on open space and recreation. I would, again, let's say yes. The first question has to do with the impairment of natural functions or ecosystem services provided by an undeveloped area. Do people understand the kind of term, ecosystem services? It's kind of a jargony term. It's kind of like an environmental economics term, which refers to like distinct, tangible services that an intact natural environment, like a woodland or like a forest, river, or like other kind of biota would provide, to like, I guess, its natural community and the human community as well. So for example, wetlands would, that ecosystem services provided by wetlands would be that they retain stormwater and mitigate flooding and add biodiversity. With forests, it's that they would provide heating, cooling effects in terms of the ground level temperature, et cetera, and improve air quality. So again, this would be a no. I mean, the site is already largely developed, but again, through the site plan review process, we'd be, as a commission, would be focused on preserving intact natural systems and avoiding, large scale clearing of trees, significant fragmentation of wildlife corridors, et cetera. So the answer would be no. Whether the proposed action may result in the loss of a future current or future recreational resource, it's possible that Hartwick College or SUNY, which operates a trail system, may choose to close it or develop part of it. However, if it's subject to a site plan review, the commission has demonstrated in the past that it works with the applicant to relocate, a trail system to ensure that the recreational resources are not lost or that impact is mitigated to the greatest extent practicable. So I would say no. Next is whether the proposed action may eliminate open space or recreational resources in an area with few such resources. The U zone has, several trail systems, and that, future development might, Harvard College's campus might, or SUNY's campus might affect that, but again, the commission would take every step to avoid having that occur, so I think the answer would be no. This D is whether the proposed action may result in the area loss of an area used informally by the community's open space resource. The new U zone regulations kind of encourage, preservation of the natural environment. They don't traditionally regulate, the loss of like a trail system like Apartment College were developed. The city can't say, no, you can't do that. However, under seeker and under the site plan review process, we have the ability to kind of push applicants to do that. To fully mitigate the kind of environmental impact of their project. So I guess, provided that mitigation measures are followed and that the commission works with the applicant iteratively, I would say the answer would be no as well. So moving on to 12, this would be a no because there are no designated critical environmental areas in Otsego County. So we can move on. Impacts on transportation. This is a yes. I would say that the proposed action is, development contemplated in the proposed action is likely to increase traffic However, what is new for this code and the MU1 district code is that each applicant that triggers site plan review will be required to submit a transportation plan to the commission, which places it, which requires applicants to place an emphasis on reducing automobile travel. It's also important to note that there are no required parking minimums, which limits induced travel demand by car. And there's existing bus service, in addition to, that area being relatively bikeable compared to other areas within the city. So I would say, for A, answer would be no, because the U zone code is attempting to reduce automobile traffic. For B, the action again would be no, because there's no minimum required parking. Again, however, the applicants could propose a parking lot of 1,000 spaces if they wanted to. However, that would negatively factor on their, chances of obtaining site plan approval by this commission. Next is whether the proposed action will degrade existing transit access. It will actually improve, hopefully, existing transit access. And the answer for the other two will be, for D will be no, because it's intended to promote multimodal transportation, which includes traveling by bike or by foot. For E, the answer would be yes, because, would be yes, but, again, it's a positive environmental impact. We'd be trying to, alter the existing dependence on automobile-based travel and promote, travel by bus, foot, or bike, or e-scooter, or whatever. So the answer would be no. 14, my thought would be the answer. I'm not sure I understand. My Apple Watch is like listening to me. Sorry. So I would say yes. And the reason for that is, it's possible that there could be new large residential developments on the college campus, hypothetically. And so future development might require the new or upgrade to an existing substation, but I'm not anticipating that it'll be to the extent that will result in a significant environmental impact. B, it's not, there's existing adequate gas and electric capacity to sustain new development, particularly high density and residential development. So I don't believe our electric and gas infrastructure would be inadequate to serve new residential demand for like dorms or whatever. For C, again, it's possible that, when fully built out in the aggregate, it might result in the use of more than 2,500 megawatt hours per year of electricity. But again, it's really too nebulous to decide. And with the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, more and more of that electricity is being required to come from renewable sources, so the chances of that having a significant negative impact are very low. D, the proposed action, again, in the aggregate, if you consider all development on the college campuses and all the new development, this is likely to occur. However, with the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act and other federal incentives, it's more and more likely that the heating and cooling will be electrified rather than relying on gas. So I would say that would have a positive environmental impact, transitioning away from clean heating to transitioning away from traditional gas-based heating and cooling systems to electric would have an overall net positive impact on the environment in terms of greenhouse gas emissions reductions. So 15, again, the answer would be yes. So the first question is whether the proposed action might produce sound above noise levels established by local regulation. The answer is that this would be temporary, especially during construction. However, there'll be, applicants will be required to work with the neighbors and with the city to make sure that noise regulations are complied with to the greatest extent practicable. For B, it's whether the proposed action may result in blasting within 1,500 feet of any residence, hospital, school, licensed daycare, nursing home. That's possible. However, again, the applicant would be required to work with the commission and with the city administrator and engineering department to make sure that all impacts are mitigated to the greatest extent practical, so that's would be no. C, again, it's the same thing, localized, but no likely impact for odor-based impact. There may be some exhaust fume smells from construction, but again, that will be temporary, and localized to the project site. D, the proposed action may result in light shining onto the adjoining properties. This would be a no because the university's form-based code requires a lighting plan to be submitted to the commission, and the commission would be required to demonstrate that no light leaks over the property line, to comply with applicable regulations. For E, the proposed action may result in, lighting creating sky glow, right? And so I guess this would, I think that it's unlikely that new sports stadiums will be created or new facilities that have, substantial light pollution would be created as part of this regulation. It's, again, Harvard College and SUNY both have all their sports facilities already constructed, and so it's not likely that they'll build, say, here, we need a brand new football stadium right next to our existing football stadium. So I don't believe that this is likely to occur, and the answer would be no. Impact on human health, I would say the answer would be no, largely because the U-Zone form-based code encourages, the preservation of strong block systems and community design, and that it encourages more active, behavior amongst residents living within there, and also has very strict design standards to ensure that, public health is protected. Additionally, the regulations don't allow heavy industry use or any other, type of use that has negative public health impacts. For 17, the answer, this is an important one for us to consider, which is because we have to consider whether it's consistent with our comprehensive plan from 2019, whether it's consistent with our, housing studies, et cetera. And so I put answer is yes. And again, if you feel like you want to discuss any of these items, please feel free. So for A, the proposed action's land use components may be different or in sharp contrast to current surrounding land use patterns. So future development proposed under this is likely to be different because the allowable intensity of use, especially along West Street, is lower, and it really encourages, site design that is much more compact rather than sprawling out. So I would say, while it will be different, it's not likely to be different negatively, it's more likely to be positive. So the answer would be no. B is proposed action will cause a permanent population, city or town of villages, in which the project is proposed to be grown by more than 5. I think, that would make the mayor very happy, 5%, if we were to grow that much, but just by the topography, and available sites for development, the answer would be no, because we just don't have that kind of capacity, to encourage, new development that would achieve that. C is whether the proposed action is inconsistent with local land use plans and zoning regulations. Since this is an action that involves a repeal of an existing section of the code and replacement with a new form-based code, on its face this would be a no, right? Because you're eliminating the old one and putting in a new one, so it's going to be no. For D, what it's asking if the proposed action is inconsistent with any county plans or other regional land use plans. The Otsego County Planning Department reviewed the proposed U-Zone zoning amendment and found that there's no issue, so the answer would be D. Or no, sorry. I don't know why I said D. E is whether the proposed action may cause a change in density of development that is not supported by existing infrastructure or is distant from existing infrastructure. The proposed action, development considered under this zoning code change would likely result in a lower intensity use, but it would increase, density within the U-Zone. It allows many different housing types by right. However, as part of the site plan review process, applicants will be required to demonstrate that there is adequate infrastructure to serve them. So the answer would be no, provided that the commission follows its applicable review guidelines. For F, it's asking whether the proposed action is located in an area characterized by low density development that will require new or expanded infrastructure. The answer would be no, because the city limits are covered by city water and sewer. There's electric and gas infrastructure present, so it's not likely to require a water, sewer extension, etc., or annexation of new land. G is whether the proposed action may induce secondary development impacts, may result in secondary impacts such as residential or commercial development not included in the proposed action. And by nature of a zoning code amendment, the answer would be yes, because zoning code regulates land use and guides and encourages development in certain areas that it's appropriate. So the form-based code divides the university zone into 3 transects based on the existing land use, the existing intensity of land use and existing density. So it's likely to encourage additional development within those transects, but by virtue of being in each transect, there will be clear limitations on the density of the development on the land and the intensity of the land use. So while it may encourage secondary development, it'll be done so at a scale that is consistent and harmonious with its surrounding environment. So the answer would be no. Any debate or questions about that one? I can move on to the last one. Okay. So consistency with community character, I would say, the answer would be yes for that one as well. And the first question is whether the proposed action may replace or eliminate existing facility structures or areas of historic importance to the community. The answer would be no, because that basically would be inconsistent with the intent of the U-Zone code. B is whether the proposed action may create a demand for additional community services such as school, police, and fire. The answer is likely to be yes. Any new development or addition of new development will likely incur new demand for services, police, fire, school, etc. However, the tax revenue that comes in as a result of that new development is likely to offset, or hopefully will offset in the long term, the demand for new services that it may cause. As part of the site plan review process, also the Planning Commission has significant leeway in addition to working with city staff to make sure that city services are capable of accommodating new developments. So the answer would be no. C, so this was a matter of some debate and concern under, at the Common Council level and by members of the public. There was concern that the U-Zone regulations may result in people being displaced, particularly in that, property owners would be able to, have up to 50% of their units be dedicated for short-term rental, okay? So under seeker, the courts have held that we must require evidence-based kind of objections or concerns, and the evidence-based concerns have to be present in the record, in some capacity. They're in a recorded verbal statement or in writing. And so while there was, substantial concern, city staff worked iteratively with members of the council to arrive at a number for short-term rental occupancy that was acceptable. Additionally, there was no evidence in the record in front of me, at least as a initial reviewer, and you can correct me if you can bring forward other things for consideration and debate that I might have missed, but I did not see any substantial evidence that pointed to the fact that people would be displaced, and the number of people that were being displaced wouldn't be able to be accommodated by the new housing projects coming online in the city. So that's kind of what I had written in part 3. It's hard to say, because the question of whether or not people would be displaced, I didn't see, I saw a concern about that, but I didn't see any evidence in the record of that actually happening.
I don't think the housing projects that are coming online are gonna be able to take people that are up in that particular apartment complex that's up there, because those are, I think, 2 and 3 bedroom units, where the ones that are coming online are either, the ones on Main Street are like 90% 1-bedroom unit, and then the one on Deed Street, the 60 units, the vast majority are for artist lofts, and there's only a handful that are 2-bedroom units.
Right.
So it's very different. So if people are displaced, I think they're going to struggle finding a place to live.
That could be, and that could be a challenge, and so the question, that I had was whether or not that's, actually happening or likely to happen.
That's the big question.
Right, and then the evidence, and the thing is that there would need to be hard evidence rather than kind of a generalized concern that, would trigger the requirement, or that would require us to prepare a draft, generic environmental impact statement in this case. The threshold is that we would have to find it likely. It wouldn't have to be definite or concrete. You can't say this will happen, but you would have to have a high degree of certainty that it will happen. So I guess, the question is, whether those 2 and 3 bedroom units in the apartment complex would be, would immediately transition to short-term rentals, or they'd, engage in eviction proceedings. but then again, you know, the two housing projects were just also examples. There could be other housing projects that come online. For example, you know, if the development above the parking garage were to come forward, you know, years down the road, I mean, who knows? That, again, that's speculative.
Well, exactly, I mean, in the last 20 years, how many projects have come forward and then fizzled?
Well, a lot, but we're on a good path. We got two coming, you know, which is good, you know. But so I think like, you know, I think that wouldn't require them to come to the planning commission, you know. But I think that I think, you know, the answer for this one would, my opinion would be like, it's possible, you know, that there would be displacement, you know, but that's the question of is whether, you know, the zoning changes under that would, you know, would create, you know, enough for us to feel comfortable saying this would be like a positive adverse impact. And whether the city's existing, you know, current ongoing efforts around housing are enough to mitigate or offset that, and to what extent would they need to do that. So that's the kind of the question that I would pose. Is my initial thought would be, you know, we are adding, you know, 88 new housing units, but to your point about, you know, them being different size and different nature, that would create a challenge. But then again, you know, if is there existing rental capacity to accommodate people if they were to be displaced from the apartment complex? You know, how many would be displaced, and you know, whether or not our existing rental stock would be able to accommodate them, and if not, you know, what other mitigative measures could the city take to alleviate that? So that's kind of the question that we'd have to discuss.
Well, I think what drew some of us to the conclusion of the 50% agreement was because when I asked Code how many permits were given for short-term rentals for the summer, I think it was last year or 2 years ago, it was only maybe 56 in the entire city. And so we're talking how many units up in what was it? The one has 64 units, so half of that, 32. And the likelihood of them filling that student complex with 50% is small. Not everybody wants to move to an apartment building. And then even if the apartment complex decides to try to rent out half of the apartment complex, it's not going to work. There aren't enough people for it. So I think they'll see that it's not necessarily worth their while financially to do that.
Yeah, so it's you know, so it'd be unlikely. I mean, my thought would be, you know, there's a potential for displacement. You know, I think it's reasonable to say that, anticipate that. I mean, you know, with the nature of any zone change or any changes in the regulatory environment around housing, there's a chance that, you know, landlords will attempt to capitalize on that, and then, you know, especially if you're operating under a lease structure, that they'll be likely to adjust that lease structure to maximize revenue, and that may result in people's leases being terminated, unfortunately. I know that the city is working very hard to, you know, provide additional affordable housing within the city limits. So my thought would be, you know, that there would be an impact, but I feel like the city's ongoing efforts would be enough. Plus, the council gave, you know, due discretion to that, establishing that 50%
Well,
threshold.
create additional affordable housing within the city is really one of two things. It's either forcing or convincing many landlords to sell, or convincing landlords to not rent to students.
Yeah.
So I've learned in the last 12 years not to underestimate greed. So,
That's true. And I mean, and if you do build any affordable housing, there's usually like, you know, caveats that you have to meet. Like with Kearney, you have to have people engaged in artistic pursuits for a large percentage, not all, but a large percentage of the units. For Springbrook, you know, you may not be able to afford renting, you know, the 24 market rate apartments. You know, additionally, however, you know, the other inherent piece of the U-Zone code is that it says 50% threshold, right? So there's the other 50% of the units will be available. So the loss, you know, if you have a 64 unit complex, you know, you're talking about potential maximum loss of 32 units under the worst case scenario. And so I think, you know, another point to consider is that you know, compared to the old U zone code, the new one allows for many different types of housing to be built without, you know, serious regulatory review. So including the MU1 district code too, which allows a much faster review process to add housing, whereas before, due to our minimum parking requirements and other zoning regulations, it was harder to build certain types of housing beyond single-family detached. So, in theory, you know, if we were to look at a future scenario, and you can get rosy if you want, or you can face reality. You know, so the reality is that our market's very challenging. It's a marginal market for new residential construction. Unless you have some sort of gap financing lined up or some sort of state or federal funding, it's difficult to construct new residential projects here. But under the rosy optimistic scenario, you know, we envision having a much more expeditious review process and approach to building new housing, and that might, in theory, again, under optimistic scenarios, attract additional residential developers wanting to build because they can. So you're talking about your triplex, threeplex, duplex, townhomes, condos, like different types of housing that traditionally wouldn't have been allowed under our old code to be now, put forward with, just obtaining a building permit from Steve. So this would be like, it's a tough one, but I would say there is an impact, but it's not at the threshold that would require a GEIS, largely because, there's adequate mitigation measures in place. And that will require, again, the commission to exercise a lot of discretion and have a very aggressive line of questioning to make sure that people aren't being displaced as a result of new development proposals. And that, again, will require us to kind of pay special attention to ongoing developments around housing in that zone. So it's a tough one, but I would say no.
Well, I think enough people are being displaced, or actually being displaced. We're going to hear about it.
Yeah,
We're
and
gonna hear about it soon.
and even if that's the case, we have to think. I think that the city is more well suited to deal with it now than it has been in the past. We have our housing commission. We have a lot of citizen volunteers working actively, but again, it's capacity and money, right? So the U-zone code itself tries to minimize displacement to the greatest extent it can with that threshold, but at the same time, the city will have to work aggressively to minimize displacement and to be coordinated about how they do that. So D is the proposed action may interfere with the use or enjoyment of officially recognized or designated public resources. We kind of went over this. The answer would be no. E is whether the proposed action is inconsistent with the predominant architectural scale and character. The answer would be no, because the whole intent of the code is to be consistent with that. F is whether the proposed action is inconsistent with the character of the existing natural landscape. And the answer would be no, for the same reason. And so that's all of them. And so now there's part 3. So based on all of this, we have, I took, the initiative of preparing a draft seeker determination, which you have in front of you. Depending on how your preference, I can read it, or we can discuss, key items here. For those, who are bored enough to view this online, once this is finalized, it will be made available on the city website. And the Common Council will also review this at their upcoming meeting, provided that, there are no substantial changes that would cause us to miss the deadline for that meeting.
And I assume the comments here are Stephen.
Yeah, so there's a couple call attention to a couple corrections. So under 10, I should add Brzee Hall. So there is one, and then I would say that it's largely confined to Hartwick College's campus, and is fully enclosed, so future development is not likely to affect that. Under 13, Steve wanted me to add that there's no parking minimums contemplated under the U-zone code, so I can add that as well. But even in the event that a developer wanted to add 700 parking spaces, let's say they want to add 1,000, right? Just because there are no minimums doesn't mean there can't be a maximum. We have the ability to establish a max. We can say, no, we only think you need 100 rather than 700, for example. And that would mitigate environmental impact. So I'll address Steve's comment. One, based on our discussion, under 18, you know, based on our discussion, I can add some language about, you know, the city's ongoing efforts to address the housing challenges through the Housing Commission, and that, you know, the Common Council thoroughly discussed potential displacement and will be actively monitoring it going forward. Or I can adjust that section, you know, whatever way you know, you all feel that's appropriate, or we can keep it as is. I'm open, you know, this is the first time you're reviewing it, so I'm open to any and all changes. I don't, you know, have any attachment to any of it really. I just, you know, after, this is my after-work project, I just can't stay away. Just work through this one. So if there's any, you know, requested changes, come, you know, please let me know for this one, and I'll incorporate that in. When do I need to send it, by the town council meeting? Probably this week, right?
Yeah, we'll be setting the agenda within the next week.
Okay, so I just, you know, if they're not like too substantial, I can just send it to you tomorrow.
So with potential displacement, is that kind of addressing like the Woodridge apartments up there?
Yeah.
Does the city have any kind of like action they can do because of displacement or potential displacement?
Like, the Common Council can pass legislation that, limits the ability to kind of, you know, push people out, and some community tenants rights groups have pushed for that, but it's very legally dubious because you don't want, you know, you know, it's possible that it could be unconstitutional. You have to be very careful about how you do it, right?
Probably the easiest way would be to go back and change the percentages in the zoning. But it's a long process, as you can see. We're still debating the whole zoning process, so that would probably be the easiest way. Easiest.
Yeah, that, you know, so that'd
But
be.
it's a private entity, you're limited to what you can do.
So that hasn't been officially passed yet,
Not
the
yet.
50%.
We're waiting
Okay.
for
This has to be
this.
first.
Yeah, so we
Right.
have to
Oh,
do
okay.
seeker before they can adopt. So I think that's the challenge, and so again, you know, one of the tricky parts about a zoning change is that, you know, the regulatory language can be excellent, but the kicker always comes in who's administering it, right? So when these new regulations come forward, you know, as the main group that does site plan approval, you know, we are the initial gatekeepers, however, but also council regularly interfaces with housing developers, the mayor and the common council members representing the House wards do as well. The housing commission to a certain extent deals with housing policy in the city staff does, so, you know, all of this requires those kind of disparate county entities to kind of be city entities to be marching in lockstep to make sure that displacement is mitigated or caught early, right? So on our end, we can all do, you know, all of us, you know, in city government can do our part to limit displacement. But again, you know, the solutions to address, you know, limiting displacement, you know, largely for private entity, you know, is very limited from what the city can do. It's very difficult. You know, obviously, you know, there's room for citizen pressure too. If there's large scale displacement, it's likely that groups would organize to oppose that. But again, you know, it's very, as long as the housing developer's not violating any, you know, state or federal laws, it's very difficult for, you know, community to stop it, essentially.
And I know there was talk about not including Woodridge. Is that out the window? And now we are including Woodridge. Now we're just talking about percentages.
As of right now, Woodridge is part of it. Originally, that was the whole
I didn't
debate.
know if that was part of it.
Originally it
Right.
wasn't, and then they threatened to sue.
Right, I
No,
remember that.
well,
Well, I saw the
The
email.
other-
not really. I mean, we could look at it that way.
Yeah.
But we were initially told that you had to include it, otherwise it didn't make any logical sense.
Right.
And then suddenly we were told, oh no, it's not a problem to cut them out. And we questioned that too, so now it's all,
So now it's just down to percentage.
I mean, you know, there was concern that it would be spot zoning, and it's really not spot zoning. But, you know, so I mean, anything, when I see the words Article 78, I just treat it as a threat.
I think an argument could be made still for spot zoning if we kept them out of it and did it only the one unit.
That would be very, you know, it'd be a hard argument for them to win, but they could make it, yeah. because, you know, like the zone would be, it's a large number of parcels, it's not just one, but also that, you know, the zone change is consistent with the comp plan that was contemplated, you know, as part of the large overall approach to rezone the city. So anyway, either here or there, no point discussing it.
Right.
So, were there any like changes you wanted me to make to 18? Or are we okay with it?
I'm fine with it.
Okay. And so I'll incorporate the changes that Steve suggests. Well, if you, so I'll send it to you with the revised version, and can you send it to everybody?
Yeah.
Okay, so what I'm going to do, I have to actually sign part 3 and say see attachment, print that out. So I guess, do we have a motion to issue a negative declaration for the U-zone amendments?
So,
Motion made by Vice Chair Marino, do I have a second? Seconded by Commissioner Mikucci. Any further discussion? Hearing none, clerk, could you please call roll?
Chair Lappin,
Yes.
Vice Chair Marino,
yes.
Commissioner Baskin,
Yes.
Commissioner Mikucci.
Yes.
Thank you. So I guess now, while we're here, I guess we should sign part 3, right?
Okay, no, perfect.
Yeah, thank you. Provide, I guess we should say, maybe we should amend the motion to, with the, as amended, right? Because Steve made the changes, or, right? Should we amend that motion?
You can, I mean, the intent of the motion is still the same, that you're issuing a negative declaration, you're not specifying the content.
Okay, that's fine. So again, you know, this secret determination will be made available on the city website, and will be considered by the council at its June 6th meeting. And so there'll be multiple opportunities to review this, and, you know, we encourage all members of the public to come forward and share their opinion on land use issues that affect the city. That said, is there any new business that commissioners would like to bring forward? Dan Maskin would be upset, we're 3 minutes over.